as managers, we always look at a couple of concepts in economics. Of course, all of us have to analyze the economy and see what's happening. In this session, I'll be discussing two concepts: the concept of GDP, which is the gross domestic product, and the concept of inflation, because they're very important for business. And business must understand what goes on in the economy, whether the economy is growing or not. If there's growing, there's opportunities in the sector, and which sector is growing the fastest. And also the concept of inflation is also important. What is GDP? The gross domestic product is a measurement of the performance of the economy. Put it simply, our country produces goods and services, people consume, and government expend money as well, and there's investors coming in the country. So if you add all of them together, gives us a value called the gross domestic product. That means all the goods that the country produce at a market price, all the services produced, the hotel services that we sell to the tourists, all this at a market price, or the expenditure by government, building roads and dams and so on and so forth. All these are built, spent by government and investors, and also people consume. We're buying food, we're buying services, we buy our mobile phone and so on and so forth. All these are consumption. You add all of them together, gives us a total value of around, last year was about 350 billion rupees. So this is a measurement of the performance of the economy. What normally happens is we measure that against growth over time. So technically speaking, if a country is growing, that means the GDP will increase every year. So from 350 billion this year, we expect it to grow at an average of what is predicted in the year 2014 to be around 3.7. So the GDP will grow, the value of 350 billion will grow by 3.7% in the economy. And what we've seen recently, this is growth, and obviously with growth you also have negative growth, so what we call recession. And very often countries go into recession technically is defined as 2 quarters of negative growth. That means the economy is shrinking. So recession is when the economy is not growing at all, or it's decelerating, which means that over 2 quarters the GDP didn't grow at all, or remains zero or negative. This is technically defined as a recession. So as managers, we always look at these analysis of the GDP, and the GDP is also important because each sector contributes to the economy. Tourism will contribute a certain amount in the sector, the manufacturing will produce a certain amount, and all of those will define where the opportunities are. For example, the construction sector wasn't doing very well last year, and this year is going to grow by an average of 2.5 to 2.6%. We'll always say there are opportunities in the financial services. That means the value of output will increase by 5%. So as managers, we use the concept of GDP very often to see whether there's a need to invest or not. Coupled with that, we also have something called the gross national product, which is very different to the gross domestic product. The gross national product is what the people, the merchant companies produce anywhere in the world. So if a merchant company is based in Madagascar or based in India producing goods and services, this is just the national product produced by merchant companies, and that excludes all foreign companies. And obviously gross domestic product is all the product produced by local people, local investors and external investors as well, all combined gives you the gross domestic product. So this is an important concept in economics. And very often now people are saying, let us not just look at GDP as a measurement for performance, because it excludes other factors, the human well-being, the environment, because that's not factored in. So the argument now is shifting from, is it really right to use GDP as the only measurement for growth, or should we look at other aspects? Poverty, for example, happiness of people. Even Bhutan came up with the concept of happiness performance. So people are more happy, and I think Bhutan is probably one of the happiest countries in the world. So these are the concepts that is being developing, and the argument is, should we really rely on gross domestic product, or should we look at environmental factors and so on and so forth? This is the concept of GDP, which all of us as managers must be aware of. The other indicator that businesses always look in any economy is the concept of inflation. It's not purely just investors that look at inflation, but government is worried about inflation. What is inflation? Inflation is a measurement of what happened over time in terms of price movement. To give you a simple example, if today we are buying a certain amount of goods for 100 rupees, Okay, that basket of good is defined by government, so that will include your food, your services, your medical expenses, and this is really defined and it remains constant for a period of time. That basket of good is measured over a period of time. So for example, if this year that value of good costs you 100 rupees, and next year the value of the same amount of good in the same basket costs you 103 rupees, that means there's an increase of 3 rupees, which is equivalent to an inflation rate of 3%. So basically what it means, your purchasing power has been reduced. So next year, what you need to do, if inflation has gone up by 3 years next year, or it is growing by 3%, what you will have to do, you have to find an additional 3 rupees to buy the same goods that you bought last year. And that simply means it's eating away our purchasing power. And why is all of us worried? All of us are worried because we will need to get more money to buy the same goods and services. There are many factors that affect inflation. Factors such as too many goods, prices is going up because production costs goes up, so people have to pay more for the same goods. But nourishes have an issue of what we call imported inflation. Simply what it means that all our basic necessities, our food, our energy, is imported. And because prices increase overseas, obviously we'll have to pay more on the merchant economy. For example, if our milk goes up, that has an effect on the merchant prices. It will have to go up. So inflation is a real problem, difficult to control here because most of it are imported. That is something that government worries about, and that's also linked to the currency. So apart from prices going up because of drought in the world, because of higher demand of goods and services in the world, the prices will go up. But the other factor that affects inflation, imported inflation, is our currency. So tomorrow if our rupee is very strong, that means the same amount of rupee you can buy more. That means you can control inflation. But if your rupees weaken, that means you will have to buy your product at a more expensive rate if you import it in dollars. What it means, if dollars today was 29 rupees, you'll buy your $1 at 29 rupees for a certain good. But tomorrow dollars rise to 35 rupees, for example, so you're spending your $1, but the product will now cost you 35 rupees. So the prices have actually increased. So inflation is also linked to the currency fluctuation. And that's why we always want to have a stability in terms of currency fluctuation against different currency. But we also have the dichotomy on the merchant economy is we import most of our goods in dollars and all our raw material import in dollars, but we export in euros. And we know that very well. There's always an inverted correlation between dollars and euros. When one goes up, the other one goes down. So in a way we are trapped somewhere. If our goods are imported in dollars goes up, and that means our import cost becomes more expensive, and then at the same time, because dollars strengthen, euros weaken, so when we export our goods, we'll find that we're having less revenue. So anyway, we are trapped somehow when it comes to this aspect. This is the part of investment, but inflation also affects all of us. Like I mentioned earlier, we have to buy our goods, and every year if inflation goes up, at some point you will have to find more money to buy the same amount of goods. And it affects people differently. So if you come from a very poor background, you spend most of your money on food and food prices increase, inflation can affect you at a much higher level. So it will not be 3%, but in your own circumstances, it can reach up to 70–80% because if food increases. If you spend 90% of your budget on food, for example, and food prices goes up, that will have a significant effect on your household purchasing power. On the contrary, if you're earning a higher salary, inflation may not affect you that much. And government worries very much if inflation goes too much, and if it goes up, government have to use something called the monetary policy tool to adjust for inflation. What it means, because your power has been reduced in terms of purchasing power, the government corrects it with the repo rate, which means repurchasing rate, which the central bank sets at a rate which is always higher than inflation. So at the moment our inflation is around 3.5–3.7%, and our repo rate is about 4.65%. That means to correct the loss of power, the government increase the repo rate to compensate you for that loss. This is, at the moment, it's okay, and there's no need to adjust the repo rate because we're still in a positive territory where the compensation is higher than the loss of purchasing power, and we call that a positive interest rate. What happens when inflation goes too high? So if inflation tomorrow keep rising and get out of hand, then and interest rate remain the same, what happens is there's not enough compensation for the loss of your purchasing power. What it means that if inflation reaches at 6% and government is compensating you at 4.65%, you're actually losing purchasing power over time by 2%. So government always want to make sure that inflation remain under control. And it's under control because investors, when they bring them, they will come in the country to invest, and also the government, when they invest, they don't want to see the money lose its power. So that's why as managers, we always look at inflation rate as an indicator of the economic performances and what will happen to our investment. These are the two things I've talked in the show today. One was on GDP and performance of the economy. The second one is about inflation, and I'll be talking much more in terms of these different indicators and why it matters to all of us as people, as merchants, but also as investors, but also as government. Thank you.